In today's video from Demystifying Proposals, we're going to take an RFP and create an outline based on that RFP in a quote-unquote live demonstration of how to create an outline. First thing we do when starting an outline for a proposal is put the RFP information on the cover page, including the name of the procurement, the RFP number, the due date, the contact information for the government, and updating any contact information for our company. If your company is one that just uses words on the cover, then you may be done. If your company is one that uses graphics, it might be time to get the graphics artist started with what those should be to speak to the RFP's topics or the customer, or both. So here are some screenshots from the RFP of the information we can use to create the cover page for the proposal. Section C, or the statement of work, tells us the title of the work from the government's perspective. The cover page of the solicitation tells us the contact information for the person to whom the RFP should be directed. The proposal instructions also have this information, though they only included an email, and we would like to present the information with more details than just the email. The proposal submission instructions also have the proposal due date, which in this case is April 2nd, 2026, and the RFP number can be found on both the cover page and in the proposal instructions. So using all of this information, here's an example of what a cover page might look like. We put the name of the RFP from the statement of work at the top. We add the RFP number from the RFP cover page, the point of contact for the proposal from section L and from the RFP cover page is in our point of contact information for the proposal. The volume name is from section L, the due date is from section A, and then we include the standard disclosure from the FAR that protects the IP of our information in the proposal. So this is the proposal format instructions from section L, or as they call them, the proposal preparation instructions. They are asking for 1-inch margins on all sides, which is pretty standard in federal government proposals, Times New Roman 12 point for text, 10 point for graphics and tables. The RFP doesn't mention actually a font for tables, only for graphics and diagrams. So this is potentially a question we might want to ask to confirm that that applies to tables as well as graphics and diagrams. A lot of times the government thinks of graphics and tables as the same thing. We also might want to ask a question about whether the headers and footers can be in a smaller font to fit in the 1-inch margins, because there's a lot of information, as we'll see later, that needs to go into the headers and footers, and fitting that in a 1-inch margin can be tough. There's also a requirement for a single space between lines. This might be a question we also want to ask to confirm that this instruction just means single space in the paragraph settings. I would ask this question mostly because we believe others may also ask this question, and the way they ask it, we may get an answer we don't want. Portrait orientation is required. Again, that's fairly standard for a federal government proposal. Company name, RFP number, contract, page number of numbers of pages is required in the footer. So as I said, that's a lot of information to fit into a 1-inch margin footer at 12 point Times New Roman. So this is what I would do for the heading for the proposal. Usually the company logo goes on the left side of the heading. Here we're using the Demystifying Proposals logo, and then you put the name of the procurement on the right side as well as the RFP number. Note that the heading, as I said, must fit within the 1-inch margin, and we have to use 12 point Times New Roman. So there's not a lot of room here to put anything else. Sometimes I might put in a more detailed listing of the procurement name or something like that, but we have very little space to work with here. So this is what I would suggest as the heading for the proposal. So as we mentioned, following the instructions in section L, there's a lot of information that has to go in the footer. And again, it's worth asking a question about font size and possibly font type, so that you can get more information in the headers and footers. You want to have your disclosure statement on every page of the document. So that's the use or disclosure of data contained on this sheet is subject to the restriction on the title page of this proposal. Again, that language comes right out of the FAR. It's very important that you have that on every page of your proposal to protect your intellectual property. Then you're required to put your company name and the date the proposal is due, and you're required to put your contract number and page number of how many pages you have also in the footer. So this is what the footer might look like in 12 point Times New Roman. Again, we would ask a question to maybe get that reduced a little bit so it's not quite so difficult to fit that within the 1-inch margin that's required. In many of our videos, we talk about covering all of section L and all of section M, even if they aren't quite the same. In this case, there's actually a discrepancy internal to section L, where the RFP lists the adjectival ratings to be used in evaluation, something that's usually found in section M, right, where the evaluation criteria would be. But as you can see on the next slide, the introduction to the adjectival evaluation omits the management plan, which is clearly required in the previous part of section L. Also, the breakdown of section L, what each of those definitions, the information about what goes into each of those sections that section L is required, doesn't include the management plan. So we wouldn't ask a question about the adjectival rating or the adjectival evaluation discrepancy because that is a little, I don't know, maybe a little gotcha. But we would ask for some clarification on the specifics of what they want in the management plan and also ask for more pages because this is limited to 20 pages and right now doesn't have any specifics for the management plan. Or you could possibly ask for the subfactor to be removed, though that could be tricky to ask since it's in both section L and section M, as you'll see in later slides. So here's a screen grab of what the section L technical volume requirements say so that you can see what I was talking about on the previous slide. See, management plan is listed as part of the technical volume. It's the third subsection listed: technical approach, staffing plan, management plan, similar experience, and 508 compliance. And then the adjectival evaluation section, which just follows immediately on the heels of the first section, doesn't list that management plan as a requirement. So it's a little confusing. But the other thing that to note here is that they are calling this here, they call it a performance work statement. And in section C, they call it a statement of work. And in other places, they call it a statement of work. And a statement of work and a performance work statement are actually kind of two different things. We have a whole video about that in our What's the Difference series. But here they've definitely confused the two. There are some things that are performance work statement requirements and some things that are statement of work type requirements. So clearly this procurement is a little confused in a lot of places: management plan and performance work statement versus statement of work. However, despite the discrepancy in section L, when it comes to section M and the technical volume instructions, they do list the management plan as a subfactor. So it's subfactor 3 here. However, adding to the confusion, it's subfactor 3 when they list the factors in descending order of importance, but when they list the specifics about how each of those sections is going to be evaluated, it's subfactor 2, the management plan. So it's confusing. This is not at all, by the way, this is not at all unusual for an RFP, but it's just things you have to think of through as you're developing your outline. So now that we've looked at section L and the way that they list out the requirements, and section M and the way they list out the subfactors, we can create those level 1 headings for our outline. We would include management plan because even though it doesn't have any further description in section L and it's not in the adjectival evaluation criteria in section L, it's still a subfactor in section M, and it does actually appear in section L. So one way or another, management plan needs to be there until we get an answer to our question about that. So technical approach is section 1 of the outline with the L&M references in the heading. I have put in section L1 as the technical approach, even though section L is actually not numbered. it's just very hard. You need some kind of a reference for that and for all the subheadings under it. So I just use the subfactor number. Same thing with staffing plan. So staffing plan is section L2 and also subfactor 2 from section M. The other sections would then also serve as our level 1 heading for the outline. So in this screenshot, you can see the 5 level 1 headings: technical approach, staffing plan, management plan, similar experience, 508 compliance. So we have all of our level 1 headings now complete in our outline, and now we just have to fill in the rest. Note that there's a dummy heading 2 and heading 3 in our outline, so that's what's there. We'll fill those in now. So there are more detailed instructions in both L and M about what the technical volume sections should include. So now we're going to add those proposal instructions from section L in the table that precedes each proposal section for that content. And then we're going to add the section M instructions as well. And then we use those details to construct the outline for the rest of each subsection. So this is a screenshot of what the technical approach subfactor 1, what the instructions would look like. So there was a fairly detailed list of what goes into the technical approach from section L, including subsections A, B, and C. The description of what goes in technical approach from section M is then in the next box as what are evaluation criteria. We put these in the outline to help the authors have guidance about what that section is going to be. So technical approach overall has to address all of these things from section L and all of these things from section M. Note that subsection B here calls it the statement of work, and we've had other places where they called it performance work statement. So again, that's just, a little bit of confusion there. But that's also where the outline that is the section, the statement of work requirements would go within section B, and we'll show you how to do that. And then there's actually quite a few sets of instructions before the ABC here. So it's really important that as you're writing to the sections under A, B, and C, or maybe you have an introductory section that talks to those specific instructions. I think the way I structured this, we can fit a lot of that within A and B. You'll see that on incoming slides, but it's very important that you not ignore that whole paragraph that starts, or the 2 paragraphs that come before the A, B, and C, because those are actually requirements, even if they're not in the A, B, and C list. So as I said, it's tempting to just pay attention to the A, B, and C and not pay attention to the instructions above the A, B, and C to make sure. But we want to make sure that we're not going to get in any trouble from a compliance perspective and also from a compelling perspective. So as I said, in this case, I think that we can take those instructions and cover them in the subsections A and B. So the language, the contractor shall provide an analysis of the task requirements to indicate their instruction of the task requirements, operating environment, and task order objectives. That sort of aligns to section A, which is talking about the problem, scope, and purpose of the project. So I think you could cover that analysis under problem, scope, and purpose. Then a contractor shall provide a description of the performance techniques and methodology they propose in the performance of this task. Aligns to proposed technical approach to comply with each of the requirements. So I think that is covered in section B, subsection B here. So that's where I would try and make sure that I'm talking a little bit to the performance techniques and the methodology that you propose in the performance of this task. Note that this is also very performance work statement language, not statement of work kind of language. And there is a section in the statement of work that's specifically a performance matrix. So clearly performance techniques is very important in this particular RFP. So you definitely need to address that somewhere in your proposal. And then the last part of that introductory section is the contractor shall provide a project plan describing the process and approach they propose to use to successfully complete each task outlined in the contract work breakdown structure. The project plan shall correlate to the contractor's price cost proposal. So again, I think that aligns to subsection B, which is asking you to address the requirements of the task order statement of work. However, it might be worth asking a question here about a project plan, because a project plan can be a very specific thing that they may be asking you to include, but you only have 20 pages to address all 5 requirements. And a project plan itself could be 20 pages. So you might ask them if they actually want a detailed project plan, and could that be in an appendix, or you might ask them how much, try and address what they mean by a project plan in some other way in a question, because it's a little confusing about how you would put a project plan in a section that's very page limited. So the first thing I would do is make the headings 2 for our subfactors A, B, and C in our outline. So I wouldn't put in the full text of subfactors A, B, and C, because those are fairly long. So I would shorten them. You want to make it language so that it's very clear how it relates to the subfactor. It's very clear that it's the same information. And then also note that we added L1A for subfactor A and L1B for subfactor B, so that you can see how, so we added that in the bracketed RFP references in the headings. Then we add the tasks from the statement of work in the outline. There are 6 tasks, each of which needs to be addressed, even though 2 of them are listed as optional tasks. Depending on our page challenges, we should also include the deliverables and the performance matrix somewhere in this section. You need to at least talk about those things and acknowledge that you saw them in the statement of work, and then maybe a quick reference to how you're going to do them, or some nominal language, but you definitely need to sort of talk about them somewhere. And then note that we added the references to the section C to the bracketed RFP references that you'll see on the next slide. It's a personal preference of mine to keep the L and M references and then just add the C references. That way, I think it's easy for the evaluators to see the complete compliance matrix. But if you need to save space in the end, which you may need to, you might end up deleting the L and M references for the statement of work tasks and just leave the section C references in the headings. We'll see how that all plays out when you were actually doing the proposal. So now the outline and the table of contents looks like this. So under subfactor 1, technical approach, which is the first section in our proposal, again, we want our proposal numbering to match the subfactor numbering. We'll talk about that again later. And then we have the 3 subsections, A, B, and C. So the first one is I shortened to project problem, scope, and purpose. And you'll see the L reference there, L1A. And then the second subsection is proposed technical approach, L1B. And then within that is the 6 tasks that are from the statement of work. So project management is that first task. That's often the first task is project or program management. The second task, the third task, the fourth task, which is an optional task, but you still have to address it. The 5th task, and then the 6th task, which is another optional task. Again, you still have to address it. And then that last section would be solutions for overcoming difficulties, which is subsection C of the main technical approach requirements in section L. So now we're moving on to subfactor 2, the staffing plan. Again, this is the same thing that we did for the first subfactor. We put the RFP instructions from section L in the first block before the text for this section. These will be deleted when we submit the proposal in the end. These are just for the authors to be able to see what the requirements are. And then you have the evaluation criteria in the second block, the section M requirements. Again, there's a subsection A, B, C, and D here, and there's some language before section A. It's, in this case, a little bit more generic, but you still have to make sure that whatever language is there, you have to address it whether that's in section A or B or C or D, but you definitely need to address it. So now we're going to break down subfactor 2 based on A, B, C, and D. So I said I said a lot of this on the previous slide. So the requirement is broken down into 4 component parts, A, B, C, D. There is language before those subsections that has to be addressed in the subsections, and I would say it fits into subsection A. Note the subfactor designation in the text of section M doesn't match the subfactor designation at the top of section M. So there's a list at the beginning of section M of what your 5 subfactors are. And then there's the actual descriptions in of what goes into each section and how they're going to be evaluated in section M. And it changes from subfactor 2 to subfactor 3 in that description. Somebody will probably ask a question about that, but to us, again, this falls is a bit of a gotcha. Since the order in the top of section M matches the order in the top of section L, I don't think I would ask a question about this, but if you want to, it's a question you can ask. So as with the technical approach, we broke down subfactors A, B, C, and D into our outline as heading 2s. We put shortened headers in the language, like I said, so that the evaluators know where they can find the content for those subheadings under section L, and that we noted, that we added that reference to the L bracketed RFP references as L2A, L2B, exact to stand for staffing plan subfactor 2. The section M instructions mention a small business subcontracting plan. This is another thing we might want to ask a question about. Usually small business subcontracting plans go in the cost volume, but at the very least, you only have 20 pages to address all 5 factors. You're not going to have enough room to put a full small business subcontracting plan in the staffing plan section. So you want to ask a question about that. And again, make the question reference to the cost volume, because the small business subcontracting plan will have numbers and costs associated with your small business subcontracting plan. How much of a percentage are you planning to give? And then based on the value of the whole project, how much that would actually be in revenue to those companies. And usually that makes it a requirement that it go in the cost volume. So you could ask the question in that way. So each of the 4 components also has subsections, but giving the page limits, I would suggest only using a run-in headings for those. If you put in a level 3 header, you probably are going to take up a lot of room that you just don't have. And then also several of the requirements might lend themselves to appendices, just like the small business subcontracting plan. So resumes, draft subcontracting agreements, service level agreements. Again, all of those things generally I would see as being put in an appendix to the proposal. So again, I would suggest asking some questions to try and get those things moved into appendices so that you can address them more fully, because in 20 pages, you're just not going to have enough room to address them in a lot of detail within the staffing plan section, but you want to provide that information. So now, subfactor 2, here's what the outline or the table of contents would look like. So we have 2, again, subfactor 2 is the heading number 2. You always want those things to align with L and M to the best you can. And since it's the second requirement in L and the second subfactor in M, having it be the second section, number 2, that's all good. You want again, make things as easy for the evaluators to figure out where you're answering their requirements, and numbering things the same is a very good thing. Section 2.1 is the staffing matrix. Note that we put section L2A here. Approach to obtain or replace qualified staffing resources is the second factor. L2B. Project director decision-making authority is L2C. And then subcontractor qualifications is L2D. Now that's a requirement that's quote unquote optional if you don't have subcontractors, but I would still put it in your outline. And if you don't have subcontractors, you could just put in there are no subcontractors and have it be a really simple response. Moving on to subfactor 3, the management plan. Here things are going to get hinky because, as I noted earlier, Section L does not have any further requirements for management plan. So as you saw in the previous sections, there was an ABC for technical approach, there was an ABCD for staffing plan. Here there's no further delineation of what they want to see in the management plan in Section L. Now, Section M, the evaluation criteria, does have some details, but it's still a little vague. So making the Section M requirement bigger so that you can see it, because it was a little small on the previous slide. What they're asking you to do is to demonstrate a sound process for providing the necessary expertise. Now, to me, necessary expertise is a staffing plan kind of a question. And so this is actually, in my mind, more of a subfactor 2 kind of a question. But they do talk about project management support, program development, strategic planning, evaluation, facilitation, partnership, staffing. So those are all the kinds of things you could potentially put in this section. But it is also another way to ask the question about what goes in the management plan section versus what goes in the staffing plan, is to point out that those kinds of requirements, when you're talking about providing necessary expertise, is a kind of a staffing plan question. And maybe you ask the question in a way that says, are you sure, or not, are you sure, but how would you differentiate between what you're asking us to do in the management plan section versus what you're asking us to do in the staffing plan section? Or you could just describe your management assistance in these areas and not ask a question. Again, there are the level of questions that you ask and how many questions you ask is a very company specific thing. We're just offering our guidance on some things that we think might be good questions to ask, but it's really up to individual companies what they ask. So moving on to similar experience, subfactor 4. Similar experience in this case is really past performance. This is the quintessential past performance list of requirements. The contract number, the customer name, the contract title, a brief narrative description of the work, the dollar value, contract type, period performance, place of performance, and the number and types of personnel, and the name of the contracting officer and or the core. They do require you to have 2 customer contacts for each of the contracts. So again, this is very classic past performance kinds of information. So even though they call it similar experience, it's essentially the same as what I would call past performance. So the requirement is for 3 recent, meaning in the past 3 years, contracts of a similar size, scope, and complexity. Again, classic past performance language, size, scope, and complexity. However, the brief narrative will have to be incredibly brief given the page limits of this volume. And given the emphasis on explaining how you would deal with problems both here and in previous sections, we would guess that this project maybe had some challenges in that area in the past. And so it might be something that you definitely want to think about how you would include that. But a reminder that any descriptions of problems encountered should also end on a positive note, possibly even leading to a significant accomplishment. Like you had a problem with the customer, you talked to the customer, you worked out the problem, and they ended up giving you a good CPARS, or they gave you an award or something like that. That can answer both those questions of a problem encountered and a significant accomplishment on the contract. So subfactor 5 is section 508 compliance. This is a long list of requirements in section L. It basically boils down to completing the standard HHS section 508 form. We would suggest asking a question that maybe that form can go in an appendix, because the form is extensive. The form is like 8 or 10 pages all by itself, so that would eat up a lot of your 20-page limit. What I would suggest is that maybe you ask a question to suggest that you talk in this section to how you do 508 compliance, and then put the actual report, the actual form, in an appendix. So here's how those 3 sections 3 through 5 of the outline would look in the outline headings. again, you have L3, L4, L5 for each of those sections. Again, section L doesn't actually have that numbering, but just to make it easy for everybody, they're listed in that order, and their subfactors are in that order. So I would just do that just to make life easy for everybody. But I don't think that these sections necessarily lend themselves to having subsections the way the first two subfactors did. So, I mean, normally I would include a subsection for each past performance, but given that your page limits are so narrow here, I think I would not do that. I would not give each past performance its own section heading. And then again, our section numbering matches one for one with the subfactoring numbering. Again, we're trying to make it easy for the evaluators. They will be expecting the order of the sections to be the same as the order of the subfactors. So do that outline in that order. A word here about executive summaries. If you're going to put an executive summary in this proposal, which is very page limited and has a lot of requirements, first of all, it should be very short. Second of all, I would not number it. I would leave it as just executive summary without a numbering so that your numbering matches the subfactor numbering. So section 1 stays section 1, even though there's something in front of it. That's what I would do because I really like that one-to-one mapping of having the subfactor numbering match the numbering of the sections in the proposal. So the last step in outlining is actually one of the toughest things to do, and that's adding the page limits to the headings. So overall, this RFP limits the technical volume to 20 pages. All 5 of those subfactors are limited to 20 pages. And also a reminder that we have several questions to ask that would hopefully make a lot of those requirements go into appendices. And so then we would be able to just put in a simple reference to that appendix with maybe a sentence or two to describe what's going to be in the appendix. But you do want to, for the authors, provide that guidance about how many pages you think each of the sections and subsections should include. And you should explain that the subsection page limits are inclusive of the overall page limit. So if you assign, say, 10 pages to the technical approach, then break down that 10 pages for each of the subsections, but explain that that doesn't mean that you have 10 pages to write an intro and then 2 pages for each of the subsections under it. No, it's it's each of those subsections is part of the overall 10 pages. You would think that would be kind of a gotcha for the authors, but I've actually had authors be confused by that. So it's just something that I would explain to them when I give them the outline, explain it in the stand-up or the outline meeting or whatever whenever you present the outline to the authors. And then also, given that section M says that the subfactors are listed in descending order of importance, that means that subfactor 1 is the most important, subfactor 2 is the next most important. And so I would allocate the most pages to the first couple of subfactors. And then, obviously you want to have page allocations for the other subfactors, but since they're less important, the most important sections should have the most pages. So here's the table of contents with those page limit assignments. Subfactor 1, as I said, is the most important, so it gets the most pages. In this case, I allocated 10 of the total 20 pages. This is also where you're breaking down the statement of work. So it's very important that it have some meat there. You've got 6 tasks to write to, and with 10 pages, each of those sections is going to be a page or a page and a half. So you need to make sure that you're addressing all 6 of those tasks within that 10 pages. Again, page allocations within the subfactors add up to the total of the subfactor. So in this case, the breakdown of 1, 1, 1, 2, and 1, 3 basically adds up to about 10 pages. It's a little under, giving myself a little bit of wiggle room. And then the breakdown of section 1, 2 into 1, 2, 1 through 1, 2, 6. Again, those total number of pages adds up to the total number of pages for section 1, 2. Same thing for section subfactor 2. As the second most, it gets the second most number of pages. Subfactor 5, hopefully you can address as just being addressed in the appendix. Like I said, it's a standard form that most HHS contracts have. So hopefully you can just do a quick reference to, how your company does Section 508 compliance and assure the company, the government, that your company knows how to do Section 508 compliance, but not provide a whole lot of details in that section, which is why it's only a quarter of a page. We hope that this semi-live demonstration of how we would do an outline using the table of contents to provide that detail was helpful. Please put in a comment and tell us if it's helpful or not helpful, or if you'd like to see more details. There were a lot of things that we would have asked as questions. So one of the things I'm going to do is follow up on the RFP and see if there were questions asked and what the answers to that might be. So if I get that, I'll provide that either as a comment to this video, or maybe do a whole nother presentation about that particular thing. Because like I said, we had a lot of questions and I'm sure other people did as well. Thank you for watching this video from Demystifying Proposals. Thank you for your time.